Hello, and I hope you're ready to be very truly disgusted in a really visceral way. And I hope that you're ready to hear about something that has plagued my mind since I first learned about it about a year ago. I have a perfect excuse to talk about it because right now I'm seeing that French people are protesting the Olympics being held in Paris by pooping in a river that is really central to my story I'm going to talk about today. I guess when the Olympics are held in a city, it just makes the city really disrupted. So a lot of the French people are protesting by pooping or putting poop in the river that the Olympians are going to have to swim in. And this river is called the River Seine. And I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, but that's how I'm gonna pronounce it. I've never been to Paris, and all I know is things that I can research and I just haven't experienced it at all. Before I get into the topic I want to talk about, which is the Paris Morgue, I want to read you a quote from Charles Dickens, who frequented the morgue a lot. And he's pretty much a normal guy. 19th century, people did not know how to cope with death, or they knew better than us. I don't know. I think that we have a tendency to romanticize and to kind of put 19th century people in a different bracket than us because it's such a long time ago. But people were just like you and me doing things like this that actually make me chill to the bone. Whenever I am at Paris, I am dragged by an invisible force into the morgue. I never want to go there, but I'm always pulled there. One Christmas day, when I would rather have been anywhere else, I was attracted in. To see an old gray man lying all alone on his cold bed with a tap of water turned on over his gray hair and running drip, drip, drip down his wretched face until it got into the corner of his mouth, where it took a turn and made him look sly. What Charles Dickens is talking about is something that I'm going to get into in a little bit, but I need to do some world building, if you will, around what was happening, why the Paris Morgue was a thing, and I like to call it the first wax museum, because this is the first wax museum. We think that we're all cool and stuff, we watch horror movies and read extreme graphic novels, and think that we're not easily shaken. But I feel like those memes where it's oh, you show a Victorian child this, they would pass out. I feel like if you showed me the Paris Morgue, I would not be chill. I would not be cool. And these people were seeing things that we can't even really comprehend. So how does the river Seine play into this? So pooping in the Seine is the least of the problems there. And it's truly, truly, truly a disgusting river. I have issues with water that I can't see all the way through, and that's kind of a separate thing. This is scientifically really disgusting, and they want Olympians to swim in this river, by the way. And when you're finished learning about all the shit that went on in the river, you will be also pooping in the Seine to prevent people from swimming in it. I think it was last April, the Surfrider Foundation claimed they did an independent analysis of this river Seine. They concluded that the river in the Seine, which stretches nearly 800 kilometers across France, remains contaminated and dangerous in the Paris area where the Olympic swimming events will be held. But the poop isn't the only issue here. There are so many human remains in this river, and there were so many remains that they built a morgue next to it to identify the bodies. Because the river was the site of so many accidents and so many people unaliving themselves, they had to make this right next to the river. Now it's something completely different, and we'll get into that. And up until now, it's only been used to put boats in and transport resources and shit like that. And this Seine River is also been called the Mirror of Paris because it is such a dark thing that also is like brings a lot of tourists in. You know, it's like it's a river, it can be beautiful, but it is such an incredibly dark reminder of things that have happened in the river. So to describe to you what the Seine River, the vibe of it, I need to describe to you the things that have been found inside of the river. It's been like a criminal hangout situation in the 19th century. It was like the place to dump something if you wanted to dump something. So this has been a health hazard since the 19th century. And I don't know why they're making people swim in it. It doesn't really make sense to me, like, because I was a swimmer, and you do need a situation where the water is controlled and it's not, I don't really understand it. Maybe I just don't watch the Olympics enough. What is under this black water, basically? The water is like a murky brown. This is what is actually lying underneath of it. First, I'm going to start with an incident in 1961, and this is just another of the hundreds of people that have been thrown into the river. So at this time, police unalived a bunch of Algerian protesters and just put them into the river. Unfortunately, that would not be the first time that would happen, and people would just be thrown into the river. Like, people treat this river like it's literally just like a place to put people and to put things. This is one of like the darker secrets of Paris, and it's not really well known, but it is like something that happened. So number one, bodies from crime are in the river, that a lot of them have not been found. Another thing is, in the 19th century, it was literally like an everyday occurrence that somebody would be found in this river just from like unaliving or falling in. These were like victims of crime, accidents, everything under the sun. You can imagine in the 19th century, people did not have cameras, obviously, like really like the way we have now. There wasn't even AC. There's basically no way to find out who is doing these crimes and how these people got in the river in the first place. It's actually insane to think that they actually solved crimes when the technology was just so hard. I think that we don't think about that. I don't know how I have a camera right now, let alone like we've just come so far. First body that's significant that I'm going to talk about that landed in the Seine was one of the famous bodies. I'm going to literally butcher I'm going to butcher this name, but it's she's called the Great Beauty of Paris, and her name is Lequanu de la Seine. So she was never found, her identity was never found, but it's thought that she unalived herself and she ended up in the Seine floating, as many people have been. She was found in the late 1880s, and her face was so beautiful that somebody made a death mask of her face because they were obsessed with it. They thought it was so beautiful. And there's like a thing that people say that she was the first CPR dummy face, but that's actually not true. I really, really wish that it was, but it's not true. Like, it would be really cool if the Beauty of France was like lived on in a CPR dummy mask and they used the same thing, but it's more like an urban legend than something that's actually proven. The person who took her like death mask was the pathologist at the time at the Paris Morgue. And we're gonna get into the Paris Morgue, but I want to talk more about the things that you're gonna find in the river there. She was like kind of smiling. I'm gonna insert a picture here, but she is beautiful, but it is very, very eerie, and like it's hard to really understand that was just somebody that was in the river, found in the river, and the pathologist took a death mask of her face because she was beautiful. That's a really eerie thing to witness, and to really that was like a person who was floating in this river, and we don't even know who she is. And if you at this time, if you had no family members, it was borderline impossible to find out who people were. Another thing that was another bunch of bodies dumped in this river was another fight. This was the massacre in September 1792. This is during the French Revolution, and the September massacres were a series of killings of prisoners perceived to be counter-revolutionaries. So thousands of prisoners were dragged from their cells and their bodies were thrown in the Seine. That is so many people in the Seine. That's a ridiculous amount of people in a river. This has obviously led to like a horrific scene of just like people in the water, thousands of people. Urban legend says that the riverbanks in Paris were stained with blood after this, which is really like, I think we take for granted sometimes that doesn't really happen that much, that the riverbank would be completely rubbed with blood in a huge area like Paris. It's actually totally insane. Again, this is like, the Seine is just a dumping ground for people, and many of them were not found and just are in there. And another thing that's in the bottom of this river is a lot of criminal evidence stuff. If you were in the 19th century and you need to get rid of something, throw it in the Seine. That's what everyone was doing. They were just throwing everything in the Seine when they didn't want it to be found by authorities, because how would they find it? They had no technology to find it. It's like, you're done with this knife, throw it in the Seine. So you can just imagine how many things are underneath that water that are totally that were involved in criminal dealings. And that's very scary. It's so funny because a big theme in this whole thing is like, we as a human species have always been extremely interested in true crime and extremely interested in like how people can do things that are so horrible to each other. It's something that has literally made us flock to information since the 19th century, and I'm gonna literally prove that in like a little bit. Another thing that's really especially eerie to me, I just don't like submerged things in the water that are like vehicles and stuff. There are hundreds of vehicles in the Seine underneath this brown water. There are countless vehicles underneath the water. So if you were to swim on the top, underneath you would be just so many vehicles. So this is cars, mopeds, bicycles, everything, anything. There's something of it in the river. One notable incident, divers recovered a 1960s era car that they most definitely thought was involved in some sort of criminal thing. I don't know why that like affects me so much, but to think that divers went down there and found a car, people put the car in the river to hide it, and they're going down there with flashlights and they find it. It's so scary to me. I don't know why that's so weird and eerie. It's just like the idea that there's cars underneath the river and miscellaneous items, including bodies. Another really, really sad thing that is in the Seine is a lot of animals. It's been a really consistent thing where a lot of animals end up in the Seine. A lot of it is also neglect or a malicious intent. This is super, super sad and unfortunate that horses were like the mode of transportation. So when they were done using horses, they would just put them in the river. Like, that's horrific. First of all, there's like a horse skeleton in the bottom of the river, but it's like, it's awful. But that's just something that people would do because they would just dispose of them, go into the next horse. Genuinely, if you were in the 19th century and you had really shaky morals because life is pretty chaotic and your horse unalived, would you put it in the river or would you go dig a 20-foot hole? Like, I don't know. I guess I can understand why they would put it in the river, but it's actually so. Last thing I'm going to talk about that is underneath this river is World War II artifacts. So this is like discarded weapons, helmets, everything for war. That's underneath the river. Proven. They found a ton of swords. Like, there's like pictures of just like swords and crap they found in the water. This is even like a problem because there's unexploded bombs in the water. Not to say that the Seine hasn't been dredged and cleaned to like avoid problems. Like, obviously it has been by the government, But still, 800 kilometers of water. We're so bad at finding things in the water. Like, as a society, as human beings, we're so bad at getting things underwater. A little tidbit I'm going to add on as well is there are a lot of historical artifacts in the scene that are really significant, like to human history, like just like little statues that we made and stuff like that that prove that we were pretty smart, and important stuff. Like, this river has been important for humanity for a really, really, really long time. Now, before I dig into the morgue, which was right next to the scene, like literally right next to it, I want to talk about the atmosphere of what death was like in the 19th century and how the world was perceiving death, because it makes it make a little bit more sense on why the real life wax museum was like totally cool and normal, and people brought their kids and brought their grandma and went there for fun, and Charles Dickens went there for fun. Like, I want to describe why it was normalized at the time, because if I said I'm gonna go see the morgue for fun, there's a little bit of a problem, because I'm not socialized for that. It feels like in our modern day, we are extremely disconnected from unaliving just in general. Like, and not to say that that's a bad thing, but our ancestors had such low life expectancies and so much disease and so much crap constantly going on and so little connection. Like, somebody could leave on vacation and you would be like, are they even coming home? So because you can't phone them a lot of the time. Like, for most of history, you can't just call Taylor up. So like, we think that we understand what it was like in like the 19th century, but I don't think that we can understand, because we're extremely disconnected from the way that people were living their lives. So because life expectancy was so low and getting unalived was like the most common thing ever, they had a lot of weird crap that they used to do to kind of deal with that. So death was like a thing of fascination for people. In North America, they had mourning customs that were like extremely, extremely strict. This is kind of like where wearing black came from. Like, for a funeral, everyone would wear black. And they also would put their deceased loved one's hair in jewelry and wear it. Like, that was like a common thing. And like, because of like plagues going on, there was so much death going on that people thought of funerals as like a very big social event, because it was so common. It was like one of those things that became like a huge event. So obituaries were widely read, and like, that just isn't a thing now. Like, but for example, if my random neighbor passed away, I would go to that, because that was just the way that it was. One of the most morbid trends that people would do was this thing called death photography. This was also known as memento mori photography, which is like, that's kind of pretty cool. That's pretty sick. This was like a thing where your loved one dies and you just make them look alive and take pictures with them. And that really explains a lot, like going into the next part. Again, like, photographs were a rare, expensive thing. So to get a memento mori photograph was like super common, because it was like, this is a really important time to get a photograph. This is the time. So a lot of people's only photos of themselves they're not even alive. I was born in the right timeline, because I love having photos of myself. This was a really, really common practice, especially because child unaliving from disease was so common. Like, it was just a really, really, really common thing to just get memento mori photographs of your child, because they would sit still for the picture. That's really, unfortunately, like a big reason, because the picture took so long to take. Extra effort was made to make people look lifelike. I actually hate this so much. Like, it really, really creeps me out. This often involved opening their eyes, painting their face. A lot of the time, if the eyes were done, they would open their eyes for the photograph and then paint them on afterwards. If I can find a picture of that, I will put it up, but like, I really hope that I don't, like, for my sake. Sometimes like there'd be props in the background, like family members or like seasonal stuff. Like, so you would pose next to your family member and take this really, really, really sad photo. That is like, you need to pretend not to be sad. I just wonder how many people's photographs of their family from a long time ago were memento mori photographs and they didn't know, because you really can't tell with a lot of them. Like, they did a really good job. So obviously this gradually fell out of favor because it is very, like, it is so unsettling. I don't know how people did this. And I thought that by researching and talking about how death was perceived in this time, it would make it easier to understand, but it really does not. It really doesn't make it easier. But this is how they dealt with loss and remembrance. And this is about the families that knew who these people were that got unalived. So we're gonna now talk about what you did if you didn't know who the person was. The actual topic of what this is all building towards, and this is the Paris Morgue. So this is again the building next to the scene. And it was next to the scene not just because of the huge amount of dumping of bodies that was going on in the river, but also because they literally put a net in the river to catch all of the bodies, and it was just too much work to move all of the bodies from the net to somewhere else in the morgue. They needed the morgue to be built next to the river. But this actually is a reason that we have the word morgue today, is because of this place called the Paris Morgue. But this is not a morgue. When we think of the word morgue, we think of fridges and really educated technicians and being sterile and having a uniform and being like kind of like a respectful thing that, you know, it just like seems respectful, it seems controlled and organized. This morgue, which is the first morgue, was built to identify bodies that nobody knew who they were, because there was no bookkeeping in the same way that there is now. Obviously, like, there's no communication really. So if you had no family members or they weren't living in Paris at the time and you were like on vacation and you didn't tell anyone where you went, they wouldn't know who you were. So they needed to build this morgue so people could come visit these dead bodies and decide if they knew anybody. And this was open to the public 24/7, just open for people to come and see these bodies. Its original purpose was to identify people, but so many bodies ended up washing up that it literally just became like, oh, these people were in the scene. Can we figure out who they are? This morgue was at its heyday at a time when Paris was the capital of leisure and entertainment. So this wasn't just like a Paris-centered thing. This was like people traveled from all over to see the morgue. This was like a fun activity. Universal Studios, let's go to the morgue, let's go get food and go to the morgue, let's go dress up and go to the morgue, let's bring our kids to the morgue. So basically the bodies were put on display in sort of like a jail kind of situation. So they were put onto beds, like metal beds, and they had no clothes on. They were put in metal beds, and then there was bars or windows sometimes so people could see into the bodies. They couldn't touch them though. So not only were these bodies victims of the river, they were victims of crime, other terrible stuff. And the most interesting thing is that there would be famous bodies. Like if someone was especially like brutally unalived in a really crazy crime, people would come from all over to see this body before it got taken away. If you can imagine the scene at the time of like this place, outside of this morgue, there are people making waffles, there's music. It's literally like, I don't know how to explain why people were so okay with this and why they were just like totally chill with the fact that they were going to see a bunch of bodies on slabs. So it was also free to attend. So it was like going to the park, you know. So these people were the fresh dead, which meant that they were like 4 days max they could stay in the morgue. But again, there is no AC, so there was a cold drip of water that dripped on the bodies from above. So there's no AC, the smell is horrific, and there's just drips of water dripping onto these bodies for 4 days. And because it was so, like, it could get hot and the water wasn't really doing anything, all of the bodies were extremely puffy. So it was actually really, really hard to identify these people anyway. And another thing is, like, a lot of people would read about something that happened in the newspaper and then go to see the body the next day because they were so interested in true crime. They literally would read about the crime and then go physically see the body. And that's one thing that I can definitely see people doing. Like, I could definitely see people doing that now, but the scene of it being like smelling awful, these bodies are just like not refrigerated and there's water dripping on them, that's something that I do not want to imagine. To help identify the bodies, they would put their clothes, or what the clothes they were found in, on top of them. So it was like they were hung up kind of like museum style. So this was literally like going to a museum. This is actually like, if someone was unalived in a serious way where they were like missing some parts, they would just swap out parts. And if they really wanted to identify someone, they would just swap out their head and put it on a different body and say, like, they would just mix and match. They were back there doing mix and match just of bodies and heads and shit like that, trying to keep them in the morgue for as long as possible to be identified. I don't even know if this really worked. I don't see how it could have worked at all. It just doesn't. Like, the other thing that they would do is, like, they would add in eyeballs, or they would pose them in certain ways, or they would categorize them as like, okay, this section of people are under the looks like, for example, like, okay, looks like this president. Like, they would, if they couldn't categorize people by name, obviously, they would categorize them by, oh, this person looks like this other famous person. And so a lot of the record books are just like, oh, these people look like Angelina Jolie. And it's just like a bunch of unidentified people, which is so sad. But it's also like, I think that we need to be more grateful for fingerprint technology, because imagine you don't know what happens to someone and they're under this random bookkeeping book under looks like Angelina Jolie. It was so grotesque because it's like this constant drip of water is just like making everyone look really scary. It's not the right place for a body to be. It's getting puffy, it's getting grotesque. And if a body decayed too quickly, like it was left out for too long, they would do a wax replica of the body. For famous bodies that were getting a lot of attention, or bodies that they wanted really to identify, they would make an exact wax replica, that's literally the first wax museum was made to identify bodies that, like, how creepy is it that when you go into a wax museum now, you're like seeing a celebrity, because we're so organized now, and it's like the first wax museum was you're going in to identify, like, who was the, like, victim of this horrible crime? Do I know them? And these wax replicas were eerily similar. And I'm really gonna try to find a picture, but there's almost zero pictures of this. I don't know why they're so hard to find. I don't think it's really good for tourism that, like, this was a big thing. After 1882, they did have some kind of refrigeration system other than the dripping, like, horrific water dripping situation, because ice and dripping water is a futile excuse for decomposition. That's not gonna change anything. Seriously, that's like, I don't know anything about anything, and I know that that's not gonna work. And I think that deep down people kind of knew that this was a really kind of disrespectful in a way, because it was getting a lot of negative attention and like sensationalization from the people running it. Like, they thought that the attention was kind of cool because it was a super sensational thing, and they would purposely pose bodies in a way where, like, oh, this is how they got unalived, like, and they would do dramatic reenactments of crimes to show like what happened. I also really want to reiterate the smell of this place. It would have stuck to your clothes. It is wet, putrid, and damp, and disgusting. It's literally the kind of smell that I don't think has probably existed since. So you're smelling this damp, kind of like putrid, rotting smell in this damp enclosed area where AC doesn't really exist yet. And you're hearing around you gasps and shrieks and murmurs and talking, because people are not silent in here, they're talking. It's like an exciting thing to go to the morgue. So there's conversations talking about, how do you think that they got unalived? Who do you think did this? Oh my God. There's just tons of people talking, speculating, trying to figure it out. And these are large crowds. This is sometimes 40,000 people per day. That is so many people. That's not just explained by, oh, it was just the time. I feel like people have had a morbid curiosity for this for forever. People just have a really morbid curiosity towards all things about mortality. So, and then there would be the occasional sob or a shout, someone recognizing someone, and it actually, the morgue working the way it's supposed to. But for the most part, it's just people getting entertainment. Another thing that happened with the morgue was that police would bring suspects of a crime, of murder specifically, and bring them, trying to coax them into saying that they did it by yelling at them, saying did you do this, did you do this? And sometimes that would work. Another thing that would happen is if someone committed a really bad crime, that they would come and visit the body just to get that extra sick freak stuff, which is exactly what would obviously happen if this was a thing today. So the Paris Morgue was literally the first wax museum, but it also was this crazy time in history where just people's relationship with death kind of mixed with their curiosity for all things about their mortality, and also their kind of nonchalantness about it, because they were taking pictures with their deceased loved ones. People were dropping like flies, because there was basically no modern medicine, and there was plagues, and there was pollution, and there was just so much stuff that we cannot even begin to imagine. So with all this put together, became a situation where people were going and visiting decaying bodies on slabs in their Sunday best, and then eating a waffle after. So the morgue closed its doors in 1907. So it didn't really last super long, obviously, because it's actually really gross. But this was basically attributed to just gradually changing ideas about mortality, and just people suddenly kind of realizing that this was really, really nasty and not really safe. They were concerned about hygiene, spread of disease, and if it was even worth it to have a literal living museum where people were there was just hundreds of dead bodies on display. Also, the professionalism of the morgue employees, they were maybe we should not be doing this, maybe we should be doing it a little bit different. Now the building that the morgue used to be is called the Institut Médico-Legal de Paris. If I said that wrong, I don't want to fucking hear about it, because I actually don't speak French. So now it's a place of professionalism and respect, but it is really, really hard to not think about the history. And why we even have the word morgue now is because as 19th century ancestors, we love to see people and try to identify them. These people really thought that they were honoring the dead, and they thought that this was the best way to honor the dead, right? I don't know what is the best way. I don't know if how these people felt about their mortality, was it better than how we feel? Because obviously we can see it in the modern day, everybody is so incredibly scared of that we're going in all these insane directions. I think it was just a combination of the perfect storm of desensitization and just the lack of medical knowledge at the time. I just thought people didn't really know how unsafe it was to be around a bunch of dead bodies. I genuinely don't. Like, I don't think it's anything other than just those two things. I don't think people were like less empathetic or anything like that. But it is a really interesting thing to think about, because of course we can learn about people from the 19th century, but it's really, really hard to envision what their day-to-day was like and if they were at all freaked out by this whole situation. I hope I thoroughly disgusted you with the horrors beyond comprehension of our past as human beings, but I think it's really, really, really interesting, and I think that being scared is a really, really fun, and I'm scared of the scene. The river, I'm scared of that. There for sure are rivers with worse stuff in them, but the scene specifically, the way that you can't see it, the bottom at all, and like the way that it's just been like the total dumping ground for everything and everyone for literally such a long time, is really creepy to me. I think some parts about it are kind of a little heartwarming, that we built this like thing trying to identify people so they could get news to their loved ones. That's pretty heartwarming in a really grotesque way, and it's kind of adorable that we tried to have some sort of control over it, even though humans had no control over identifying people. There was nothing that they could have done, but they really tried. You know, at least they tried. This isn't really my usual content. I usually do horror movies only, but this is something that just really interests me, and I hope that you enjoyed the story. I would love to know more about it, because it's really, really, really hard to find information on it. If you look up the Paris Morgue, there's like 5 articles and that's it. I had to listen to a lot of like, you know, whatever, historians and shit like that. Moving on from the Paris Morgue, because I got that hyperfixation off my chest. Like, I've been actually thinking about it for so long. I think that I'm interested in maybe doing a psychology iceberg. An iceberg is like when you describe each tier of the iceberg, and the bottom is like really dark and scary concepts. The top is like more surface level concepts, whatever. I've been really interested in the psychology one that some guy posted like 3 days ago, because there's so many things in there I don't even know about. And I don't know, I never took a psychology class because I dropped out of art school. So if I explained it, anyone could understand it. But if you're not into that at all, let me know and I won't do it. I was thinking of continuing my creepypasta iceberg that I started on TikTok, but I was running into the problem with the creepypastas where they were either way too long that I couldn't finish it and give it a true review and like give it my true opinion and give it a true like synopsis. So I ended up not being able, I just was skimming a lot of the stories, and I didn't like that, because I think with horror, there's so much in the detail, and I think it would have been actually impossible for me to do a true creepypasta iceberg, because some of them are like pages and pages and pages, or it's like an entire website full of lore, and I want to give each story the respect it deserves by actually reading everything about it. So I don't know what to do about that. Like, I actually don't. I think that maybe I'll have to do individual stories instead of like doing the whole iceberg. Maybe I'll just do the bottom tier of the iceberg, because that's what we come here for. If you know, like when I watch iceberg videos, I go to the very end. Like, I'll watch the beginning, but I'm locked in at the end. Let me know if I should do the psychology one. I'm really interested in that. But yeah, I think probably the next like solo YouTube video I'm gonna do is a vlog on the day that I go see Maxine, because I'm getting to see it early. And I think that's like, I think it's my second most anticipated horror movie of the year. I think my first is Longlegs. That one, I need it so bad. Show me to me, please. Nick Cage and like uncanny horror is something that, it's like they made it in a lab for me to enjoy. Okay, peace out. Thank you for watching my video if you watched to the end. Love you, bye.